Hello and welcome to Shop Talk Live. On the panel today we have Eric Lorenzine. Eric's the Head of Analysis and Consultancy at the Norwegian EV Association. Sophia Nadua, BP's Marketing and Innovation Director at the Advanced Mobility Unit, and James Carter, who's a consultant at Vision Mobility. Dan, over to you.
We have this global conversation every Friday at 2 p.m. UK time. And as usual, I'd like to give a very warm welcome to our international audience for tuning in. We have 30 countries watching today, which is terrific. Welcome to our panel, Sophia, Eric, James. Let's crack on. Let's start with electric vehicles. Will the crisis and the slowdown impact upon EV adoption? James, can I start with you?
Sure, thanks, Dan. Firstly, Dan, thanks for having us here today. It's great to be here, and we really appreciate being able to talk about these things today. And moving on to EV adoption, what are the impacts that will happen on EVs because of COVID-19? And I think that's a real question that we're all really thinking about. But I think in summary, there's three things that we need to think about and understand. One is climate and pollution. And, I think people have seen with the vast amount of traffic that's come off the roads that airs have just been much cleaner. And, people say, let's maintain this air. Let's breathe something that's nice. So I think that's one point. I think the second point is we know that crisis generally accelerate trends that are already out there. And, I think what we'll see is an acceleration of EV and, almost a speeding up because of what's the general feeling of what's been going on. I think the third thing we're seeing, and this is combined with some forecasts that we've just seen lately with BNEF, is that during this time we won't see as big a drop in the overall sales unit volumes over this year of IC versus EV. And one of the reasons for that is EVs are just simply in a much tighter demand situation. So those orders are still coming through and being delivered, while on the IC side, these vehicles are in stock and people just can't get to dealers to drive those vehicles. So I think those three things are key.
Very, very sound points. And by the way, before we move to you, Eric, James, I just want to say I really enjoy your posts on LinkedIn.
Thanks, Dan.
And anyone who doesn't follow James, 26,000 people do. So probably worth thinking about that, and you won't be disappointed. Thank you for that, James. A very sound point. Eric, I know the EV Association in Norway very well. I mean, you really know what's happened over the last few years in Norway inside out. What's your perspective on this same question? Will the crisis slow this down or not?
Well, first, thanks for inviting me, and I think James made some excellent points. But I think it's really important to remember that we have some very strong drivers behind electrification, and those are not going away. We need to reduce our emissions. We have policies in place to do that. For instance, we have the CO2 targets in Europe, but also in China. We also have policies at a local level. And of course, we have a strong push for renewable electricity generation. That's all good. But the really important thing, I think, is the fundamental improvements when it comes to battery technology and battery costs. And that is not stopping, that is still happening. And I think that is why electrification is going to happen.
So you're right. I mean, that continues regardless of what happens elsewhere, because there's so many commercial imperatives behind driving that. That hasn't been slowed down.
No, definitively not. And I think we'll only see yes, we will have a drop in 2020, maybe 2021, but then we'll see a stronger bounce back for EVs than for the internal combustion cars, I would say.
Yeah. Thank you, Eric. Now, Sophia, do you agree with what's been said? And what about the question that was posed? What do you think?
It's interesting. So before COVID, we had done some primary research, and it said about 35 to 40% of drivers are looking to buy an EV when they're next in the market, and that's quite a big number, And obviously there are barriers because price of the cars, the demand is quite tight, a bit of insecurity about technology. But my personal view is that as we go through COVID and we're seeing clearer skies and people are reassessing
Right.
in terms of what's important in life, I think that demand is just going to increase, and I think we're going to see even more of an appetite for more electric transport, and that's not just the personal car, but electric buses and also vans and delivery vehicles and personal mobility. I think we're going to see more and more demand for electrified transport.
Let me just throw one other thing into this question before we move on. What about, and Sophia, perhaps you'd like to take this first, but what about the impact of the economic slowdown? Because obviously we have the health crisis and then we have the economic crisis, and obviously both are happening, but the economic crisis will probably last longer than the health crisis. But how will that impact upon purchasing EVs, you know, for consumers, for instance, and investment decisions from a company fleet perspective as well, perhaps, and you know, to the question of the pace of EV adoption. Come back on that.
It's a good question. I think if you're a personal EV, if you're a personal driver in the market, I think you're going to look very close to your budgeting, and you may not actually be in the market in the short term for a new car, whatever type of engine, because I think many people are losing jobs, many people are worried about economic uncertainty and are going to hold on to their PCPs or whatever leasing arrangements they've got, or just drive that car a bit longer, because that car has been sitting in your garage for a long period of time. And I think fleet managers are facing the same conundrum. It's like, should I electrify my fleet now, or should I wait, because I'm not really sure. But of course, we're seeing, because of commerce and because the way commerce is shifting, some of those decisions, especially in terms of fleets, have to be made soon, because you're seeing ULEZ zones and other pressure by governments encouraging the electrification of fleets. So I think you'll see that tension continue, but hopefully you'll see some support from governments to help ease the economic pressure and keep the clean airs, the cleaner skies that we're seeing.
I mean, that tees up the next question on governments. But before we go there, just on fleets, James, I know you've got some real understanding of this point, and you said you were keen to raise it. So maybe you'd like to come in on fleets as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think, you know, once we compare the different sectors of the fleets, you know, we start to see, you know, where the most, you know, viability is. You know, and we've certainly seen with regards to, you know, some big moves made by global parcel delivery companies. You know, we're talking about, you know, especially UPS. We've seen, you know, guys like Luke Wake, you know, really make big efforts to, you know, electrify their fleet and get around, as Sophia said, the ULEZ zones. And I think, you know, combined with, you know, many governments around the world wanting to incentivize this, and I know we'll get onto this in a little bit. However, you know, especially fleets are saying, look, what's my TCO? What's my total cost of operation from when I buy this car to when I'm finished with it? And what we're starting to find is that the bigger the vehicle, those TCO costs are actually more favorable towards, you know, electric vehicle. And, you know, what we see with fleet managers that's really important is that they start looking very carefully at those numbers over that total lifespan of that vehicle, not just the upfront purchase cost. While we as buyers, and I know I do it, when we bought our vehicle, we're going, oh wow, that's a big jump in the cost, not necessarily realizing that we're only ever paying a few cents, you know, per kilowatt hour that we're putting in our vehicle. So there's a shift between the capex and the opex balance that I don't necessarily think that consumers have a good handle on.
No, it's very good point. Anything to add on that one, Eric, before we move to something which I know you're going to tell us a bit more about, which is governments and what they're going to, how they're going to influence things going forward?
Well, I think it seems like we are more or less on the same page when it comes to the direction we're going to take for the next few years. But of course, we will have a bumpy road for a couple of years. There's no question about that, I think.
Great. Well, let's take the next question then, which was, are we going to see a new legislative direction of travel from governments, and thinking globally, but you can all talk to the countries that you particularly would like to talk to, or will governments double down and green their COVID-19 bailouts? And we're seeing evidence of everything, but who'd like to take that first? Perhaps Eric, you could take that first.
I would love to, because this should be a really simple answer. Should be. We should be doubling down. We should be greening the recovery packages. We need to reduce our emissions, and this is what we should do. If we're going to do it, well, that's of course another discussion. But in my opinion, there is a lot of reasons to be optimistic, and we see a lot of very promising news from around, at least in Europe. For instance, France just announced that they are going to have a support scheme for the automotive industry, but they are going to do that by supporting low and zero emission vehicles. So they will both support the industry, but also support the shift towards electric mobility. And maybe even more promising is the reports coming out from the European Commission, where they are supposedly discussing EVs as part of the Green Economy Recovery Plan, which is going to be launched next week, I think. And they are supposedly or reportedly discussing both more support for charging infrastructure, which we really need, but also they are discussing a union-wide exemption from value-added tax on EVs. And that would be a huge shift in electric mobility in Europe.
Yes, James, would you like to build on that answer and maybe give us a US perspective as well from what you're seeing there, which may be slightly different, perhaps? I don't know.
Yeah, no, good question. So I'm in Canada and I'm Australian by background, but obviously I watch the US market pretty closely. So they're the three markets that I'm always watching. So, you know, what we're seeing, I think, firstly, from a Canadian perspective is, you know, the government wanting to get in the ground projects right now. They're saying, you know, we're looking for shovel ready, what they call shovel ready. So, you know, certainly from the EV side, you know, there are a lot of things that can be done on those shovel ready projects that they are already supporting. For instance, like electrifying condo and multi-dwelling, you know, buildings, you know, increasing the amount of high power electric chargers out there. And I think the government in general is very, very supportive of reducing transportation emissions. And I think we'll see, you know, in the next, you know, few months, there being even extra incentives to support that from Canada's perspective. US obviously is a little different. You know, we know what the environment is down there in terms of at the federal level. However, at the state level, you know, we are seeing some of those states, particularly California, use this as an even more, you know, bigger driver to drive, you know, clean air. And obviously they've always been the leaders in the US, and, you know, that will continue. You know, for Australia, you know, Australia is kind of like US. They're not particularly on board with EVs, and they are, you know, more leaning towards the, you know, I guess the oil and gas ideals. However, I think one of the really important things that we've seen with the right-leaning Quebec government is they've said, you know what, we can see very, very clearly that electrification of transportation is a very clear economic benefit. And once you start going along these lines, it becomes very obvious for even right-leaning governments to say, you know what, this is something that we need to get behind. We need to support our businesses by offering low-cost transportation. And by the way, it also is very good for the environment. So that's the message that, you know, I think we need to get across to show, you know, different governments that this is not just good for our air and the environment. It's also very, very good economically as well.
Thanks, James. Sophia, on that question, finishing up, do you agree with what's been said? Differ?
I mean, consumers want, people want clean, affordable, and reliable energy. Yeah. So the cleaner the energy can be, the more reliable, the more affordable. Obviously, COVID or no COVID, customers going to be happier. Governments actually know that. And again, it depends on the way that let's say the industry lobbies and the way that the consumer groups encourage that transition. But I think the challenge is that governments are going to be under a lot of pressure because, of course, they've been borrowing heavily to sort of just try and keep the unemployment level down, to keep businesses from going under. So it's going to be quite hard, I think, for governments to let's say do the kind of green initiatives that they should have put in place, to Eric's point. But to be honest, I think citizens generally want this to happen. So I imagine there will be continued pressure for us to introduce more and more initiatives which help that. And for instance, in the UK, there's been a 0% benefit in kind in place at beginning of April. That hasn't had even time to have any effect of it because we're in the middle of lockdown. So there are, I think, quite a number of initiatives already there to help. And so I think it's just a matter of getting on a lockdown, trying to manage the economy and the effect of the economy. But yes, things like 0% VAT will be hugely helpful in Europe, which actually has quite a positive attitude towards electrification.
So in many ways, just thinking about what how you've all answered that question, in many ways, on the whole, I guess it seems that governments are going to try and green their COVID-19 spending as much as they possibly can, because there's a consumer, acceptance that that's the right thing to do. So in other words, that's probably going to happen quite a bit globally, isn't it?
Well, if I could add, from a consumer point of view, the EV drivers in Norway are incredibly satisfied with being EV drivers. And I think this is sort of happening all around the globe where you have EV drivers, but we still need a bit of help on the purchase price. The total cost of ownership is good in many countries already, but we still need a bit of a push on the purchase price. And that's why I think the tax exemption on the value added tax would be such a great benefit for pushing this in Europe.
But it's not just that, Eric. I think we as the industry, we have a job to do too. So in other words, a lot of consumers, a lot of people say, yes, I would like to buy an EV, even if the purchase price is still within my reach, but I can't see the charging infrastructure. It's not visible. You know, there's maybe not enough of it, or it just doesn't feel that you can drive the same way you've driven in an ICE car and an EV. So I think there's work that you at the association, given Norway's been a brilliant developed market. I mean, James, with your brilliant community, there's a lot we need to do as well to help remove those barriers. I
definitively agree.
Yeah.
Good.
But I always say that there is no point in building charging infrastructure if you can't afford to buy the cars.
Yeah.
You definitively need more charging as well.
Right. Particularly, I think there's a real opportunity to move forward in multi-dwelling, and that's the barrier that we're seeing here in Canada, is just people want to buy an EV, but they live in a condo, they live in an apartment building or flats. There's nothing there. What do? And so that's, I hear that so often, I want to buy it, but what do I do? So to me, that's a big direction that we should think about.
Okay, guys. Let's just step back a bit and look at the broader mobility question. I know we could talk about electric vehicles genuinely and we haven't even got into charging networks in detail. But let's just step back and just think about the broader mobility question. And if I could address this to you first, Sophia, I mean, how does the mobility transition fit into this new normal? Is it pushed off course, on a different course, same course?
Well, it's a different course. So in the area of shared mobility, I think you're finally seeing governments unlocking this opportunity and opening up access to shared mobility. So in the UK, for instance, e-scooters, you can now potentially from next month, you're going to see e-scooters on the streets of London, which we haven't been able to. It's been quite in a geo-fenced area, testing and learning because of safety concerns, which are actually quite valid. You've seen the explosion of e-bikes. And I think that shared mobility will help in terms of personal transportation. I think ride hailing, so individual ride hailing, the likes of Uber, probably going to struggle in the short term. But I think we shouldn't forget the opportunity, for instance, for multi-occupancy shuttles to sort of bridge that gap between public transport and personal mobility. That will help as well. You're seeing in China, Baidu is expanding its AV trials, its robotaxi trials in Changsha. And so you're seeing a lot potentially removal of that customer barrier towards autonomous vehicles. And I think you'll start to see potentially maybe a little bit more acceptance around autonomous vehicles. And of course, I work for BP. Most of our business goes through our gas stations, and there are 500,000 gas stations in the world, not just ours. And so our gas station is going to have to go through quite a big change in being able to meet the needs of a changing mobility environment. But it's a dynamic asset, and it's something which we have been looking at and we continue to look at. But I think there will be changes as well.
So a bit of change, of course, on the mobility transition. James, do you just quickly agree, disagree on that one?
Yeah, no, totally. I think absolutely that's the case, and very much agree with what Sophia's been saying. I think the other thing that's really important, we are seeing these big drops in transit. We are seeing these drops in Uber usage, and other micromobility, for instance, during this time. And I think that's not unexpected given the situation in COVID. However, I think one of the things that we've been looking at closely is trying to understand mobility on a much closer point towards current car dealers, towards current needs around car usage and car ownership. And I think there's two things that are really clear. One, because of the economic situation, people can't commit. And Sophia alluded this to before, and Eric did as well, that those upfront costs are high, particularly if you want an EV. But to buy any car at all, you're into a big cap cost. So one of the ways that dealers and OEMs can help bridge those gaps are really important. And we've been looking at things like very short-term micro leases. We've seen Hyundai here in Canada offer their Hire a Hyundai program for 3 weeks. So you can have a car for, $500, which, having an all-in car for that amount of money at just a slight bit more than the cost of a lease is a really good deal. And, that's also significantly cheaper than renting a car. So there's a whole new option within this retail space that I think is really worth developing. And I think we're going to see some really other interesting new shared models pop out that align themselves with both the dynamics of COVID and the realities of the marketplace. And I think putting those two things together are going to be real winners.
I think that's really interesting. Eric, anything to add to that?
Well, we definitively see a lot of new different models when it comes to car buying or renting or leasing and things like that. But at the same time, in a time of crisis, it's very nice to own your own car. But of course, after the crisis, I think we'll see the different new services continuing to develop. But I don't think that the privately owned car is going to go away anytime soon.
Well, I guess one conclusion, and I think this was in the Bloomberg Electric Vehicle Outlook report, was that in times of crisis, private car ownership is something that's very reassuring for people. So that I think that has resonance, doesn't it?
Definitively. And if you have an EV, you can charge it at home, then it's even nicer. Yeah.
Well, just to the audience, we've got quite a few questions coming in, and I'll start to feed these questions through to panelists now. We love to encourage interaction, so we'll do our best to get through as many of these as possible. So keep firing those in, and then I'll keep putting them to the panelists. One question which has come in immediately: will home EV charging dominate over roadside retail charging? And Eric, maybe you'd like to take that one first, because I guess in a way you've seen that happen and develop in Norway.
Well, from our point of view, we wouldn't recommend that you buy an EV unless you have access to charging either at home or at your workplace. So I definitively believe that EV charging home charging will dominate over roadside charging, but we will need fast charging as we go as well. And then, of course, as James mentioned and Sophia mentioned, we need to fix charging at home for those living in apartment buildings and so on. But that should be sort of the backbone of charging should be home charging or normal charging. It's cheaper and more efficient, and it's just easier to do, really.
But Eric, that's almost impossible in many countries. I mean, if you think of it, you've got less than half of households have off-street parking, and so the challenge is how do you enable mass adoption? And it's nice when it's the early adopters and they're fairly wealthy or very techy. When you get to the mass market, we have to figure out a new infrastructure model that ensures that anyone can own an EV, not just if you have access to home charging. And I think that's been one of the biggest barriers. How do you unlock that? It might be a bit easier in Norway, where maybe I know many people have access to home charging, but in a lot of countries you don't.
But I definitively agree. But I just say we should try to fix home charging where home charging is possible. And then we need sort of curbside charging. We need super fast charging and fast charging. We need charging garages and facilities, definitively. But where you start with sort of the slow charging, because it's cheaper and more convenient to park overnight. It can be at your own parking spot, it can be at street level, but I don't think we'll see many EV drivers only using fast charging like we use gas stations today.
I think, but I think what you'll see is that because I'm not even seeing, let's say, gas station roadside as such. You have workplace, you've got destination. It's essentially where you can dwell for maybe half an hour. You go shopping, you go to the gym, you go watch a film. And of course, then you can stop at a gas station or a charging hub. You can get fast charge. I think people almost have to be trained a bit, or let's say open up. Is it no longer, it's just not one place to get fuel. There's many places. And it's just understanding that you can actually do this around your normal behavior, normal journeys. And that's actually quite exciting. But I think most people, if you don't have home charging or that capability, people are quite nervous. And it shouldn't be the case. We should make sure that it's possible for everyone.
I completely agree.
Yeah. I think the points here is both. It's kind of like people want the most convenient way to charge the car that fits in with their lifestyle. And you know, whether that's at home charging, which that is for me. And I think for many people who buy an EV, it is, you just, you know, plug it in and get up in the morning and wow, you got a full tank, as it were. However, you know, definitely there is the case where people do travel a lot. There's a case where people are in apartment buildings or they just have, you know, on-street parking where there's no chargers. So how do they get around that point? And I think they are real issues that we need to solve and, you know, need to figure out the many different ways to get past those. So this is a bit of a multi-dimensional problem.
James, can I just stay on you? Just one other question that's come in is, what about thinking about the mass market? What about second-hand used BEVs? Is the price after COVID-19 actually going to go down for those, go up, or stay the same? What do you think?
Yeah, good question. I don't think you'll see much change. You know, if you have a look in the supply situation and you know, with what's out there right now, you know, we do see much more inventory of IC vehicles at, you know, dealerships right now. We've seen EVs being much tighter in supply over the last few years, and because of that situation, even with the demand drop, you might see a smaller drop in price of EV, but you're going to see a much bigger price drop for IC vehicles out in the marketplace. So, you know, I think the other things that we've seen happening is that on the used market, the lease end values and the values for secondhand vehicles have been rising. I mean, you know, 3 or 4 years ago, you could have bought a Nissan Leaf for next to nothing. However, when you bought that Nissan Leaf 3 years ago, it's worth more. That same age vehicle is worth more now than it was then. So there's been real dynamic change in the marketplace, you know, as with EVs have become much more popular and more viable for most people.
Thank you. Sophia, a question come up just in response to your point about the 500,000 gas stations in the world. And how are companies like BP going to evolve to support the adoption of EV charging on the go, that kind of thing? I mean, I know this is something that BP and other companies have put a lot of time and planning into.
Well, I mean, we have arguably 3 or 4 approaches. One is what you see in China, where we've partnered with DD and we've set up dedicated charging hubs to be able to service what is the biggest electric vehicle ride-hail fleet in the globe. And so we've partnered and we are deploying hundreds and hundreds of charging hubs in China. Another way of doing it is putting high power charging on our existing gas stations. And that's something you see in the UK and you see in other markets. It's in Germany as well. And that's another way of ensuring that people who have 2 cars in their household can see that there is charging available for the second car to make sure that they can also be able to get where they're going. And in the third way for fleets, I mean, there is a lot of opportunity for us to improve the charging infrastructure to support fleets. But I mean, right now, as Bloomberg said, there are about 500,000 electric buses in the world. There are 400,000 vans and trucks in the world. In the US alone, there are 28 million trucks and buses. That's 10% of the car park. You know, it's over 28% of the emissions. There's a lot to do still on the fleet side. And so we're looking at how do we build out infrastructure that supports not just the passenger car market, but the fleet market. So stay tuned, you'll see more solutions there as well. But with the gas station park, you will see changes to it. But as you have already seen, there is quite a bit of charging infrastructure going at gas stations. And I know that happens in Norway as well already. And that's one of our sort of markets we look to in terms of how the market evolves when it gets more developed.
It's a test lab, isn't it, Eric? Let me just stay on one point that you made, but this could be go to anybody. Thinking about China's strategy going forward and where China is, because obviously China is a key driver in terms of electrification and also mobility, as you were mentioning earlier, Sophia. Anybody like to sort of see how this does China stay as it was? Does it intensify its developments in terms of mobility, electrification? Any comments on that? James.
Okay. So, you know, I think one of the things that we are seeing from China is that there is a, you know, a real, you know, China is really the hub of adoption, and, you know, it's a huge population, and we've seen the government take a very, you know, you could probably call it a fairly top-down approach towards driving electrification in that country, and that's good and that's fair. And consequently, we're seeing, you know, strong adoption rates. The other thing, obviously, China's got a very strong industrial base and is able to supply, you know, much of the, you know, electric motors and things like that. They do have advantages with having much of the rare earths in China that can supply some of the very high performance electric motors that are used in cars like Tesla. So, you know, I think they do have a natural advantage there. They do have a real desire to reduce their emissions. We've all seen pictures of Beijing and Shanghai with, you know, just completely washed out because of terrible pollution. So, you know, there's no doubt that their government program is going to continue, and the adoption rates there are going to be strong.
I think in China, I think what's different to China is that if you remember, people didn't really grow up with ICE vehicles. You had a very, very small penetration rate of ICE vehicles in the Chinese population. So for people, it's quite natural that their next car could be an EV. There's no resistance that, oh, I've always had a nice car and I want to hear the sound of the engine. You don't have that sort of resistance that you have in the West. Who, you know, in Germany, people say it's my car, my house, my dog, my wife. You know, there is a real strong closeness to your car in the West, which the Chinese don't have. And so that's why, for instance, the whole sharing economy is just exploded. And that's actually quite good, because the more people can become users of vehicles, not only owners, that will help the globe as well in terms of hitting climate targets as well. So I think it's a great ecosystem to study, as is the Norwegian model in terms of how we think the world will move to in the next 5 to 10 years.
I also think that they have so strong reasons to go electric in China. One thing is the local air pollution, as James mentioned, but also we see that Chinese companies are coming to Europe with their products. They've been doing it with buses, electric buses, for years, and this year we're also starting to see passenger cars from Chinese brands entering European markets. So they have sort of a very strong push to do this from an environmental side, but also from an industry point of view.
Yeah, you're right, because BYD is probably the biggest provider of buses in the world, by far. I mean, you're seeing a lot of the commercial vehicles as well. They are leapfrogging some of the traditional sort of European OEMs, and that's a challenge, because actually the vehicles aren't bad. Yeah, and they're understanding that you don't necessarily need, let's say, a battery size of 800 to 1,000 kilowatts to be able to have a viable commercial van. You can still get away with 100 to 200 kilowatt size batteries, because you're operating it in a slightly urban environment. So I think some of the way that they're thinking about the commercial EV market is good for us to learn from as well.
Just looking broadly at and moving on to sort of sustainability, which we maybe end up talking about a bit more. But one question on China: does it matter that China's EV vehicles are 80% powered by coal and oil-fired power stations? That contrasts with the situation in Norway, Eric, doesn't it, where 99% of your energy is hydro? Anybody like to sort of take that in terms of, and we'll start looking broadly at sustainability perhaps towards the end of this session.
I'm going to jump in on that. You know, one of the things that I think is really key is the connection of our, you know, greater global energy, you know, to our transportation. And, you know, obviously, you know, Sophia works at that, you know, nexus point of that. And I think one of the things that we're going to really see is the growth of Gridside battery. There's a couple reasons for that. One is it's a very efficient way of storing electricity, and we're starting to see these very large deployments. We saw in Australia, we saw the Tesla Hornsby battery plant. I believe they're around 200 megawatts now, but they're doing extremely well on 30% year-on-year returns. So that they're having these huge returns where they're not only being able to do things like grid balancing for total peak shaving, but also for frequency balancing as well. And so they're doing extremely well out of that. And I think going on from that and to connecting some of the points with heavy duty that Sophia made, I think when we're seeing the fast charging that will be coming very soon with heavy duty, being able to connect Gridside battery to prevent demand charges from the electric grid to, fast charging these heavy duty vehicles in, say, 1 megawatt battery in half an hour, or, whatever that might be. I think that is a real enabler for heavy duty transportation, particularly to bring down those OPEX that we see are very, very high for particularly diesel operated vehicles.
Very, very, very good. Anyone else like to comment on that before we sort of take another question on sustainability more broadly?
Well, I think James made some excellent points, but of course the energy supply or the electricity supply is a challenge we need to solve at the same time as we're introducing electric vehicles. And I think there is a lot of synergies between electrification on transport and the stationary power supply as well. So we need to sort of do both going forward.
Agreed.
Well, let's just take a point here. The Economist, if you look at the front cover of The Economist this week, it's got a big picture of a, well, I won't try and explain the picture, but take a look at it. But it says, seize the opportunity. And there's a couple of stories and a lead article really focusing on what we discussed earlier around governments, greening their relief and business support and so on. But the point in the article, which I thought was really interesting, is that if you look at the International Energy Agency's predictions for global industrial greenhouse gas emissions in 2020, they're still only 8% lower than they were in 2019. So if you like, planes, trains, automobiles all stop. Big part of the world stays at home, and yet the gap there is still, in terms of meeting the sort of Paris, the Paris ambitions, it's still a vast gap to be met there. So, I mean, it's almost an impossible question to put to you, but in many ways, I suppose, this experience has been a bit of a test lab, hasn't it, for the difficulty of tackling decarbonisation.
It's not going to happen overnight. It's incredible. I mean, my company, we have committed to being net zero by 2050 or earlier. Many people say that's not fast enough. We will move fast as we can. And the ambition, I think, for everyone across the industry, and we're seeing more and more companies coming to the table to say, we want to do this, we want to do this faster, because actually people want cleaner, affordable and reliable energy. And that's something which, and it doesn't matter if you're a developed country or you're a developing country like China or India, probably it's even more important for us to get there faster, because of course of the size of the populations and also their needs as well. As populations and countries mature, they're going to want the same things that we want, and it's how do you ensure that that's done in as clean a way as possible, but not impede their development goals as well, because citizens, they want the same thing we want as well.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
It was always going to be a huge effort to reduce our emissions fast enough. But I think sort of we have the technology to do a lot of it, but we might, or we will also need to change outside technology. We will need to change habits as well, I think. But it was never going to be easy doing it. And I've seen that number of 8%, and it's slightly depressing.
Jane, would you like to comment on something which I know you were interested in talking about, which is Gridside batteries, which maybe flows naturally on from the discussion?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, just going on from a little bit about what I mentioned there. I think the thing about Gridside batteries that I think is very exciting is one, these being, high efficiency abilities to store energy. And, certainly one of the big challenges that we've seen in the electricity grid is that duck-shaped curve of, how do you minimize peaks and how do you make the most of the valleys? So, how do you shift, in other words, to a much more level supply? And, certainly the problem that we have always seen with renewable energy is there's no electricity generated when the sun's not shining for solar or the wind's not blowing for windmills. So, I think the ability to be able to store that energy and use it later is of obvious benefit. But there's, as mentioned before, it's also of obvious benefit to be able to buffer the grid against shocks and things like, ultra rapid charging for heavy duty vehicles, where you're pulling out 1 megawatt, the equivalent of 2 small towns all at once from one truck. There needs to be some sort of buffer. There needs to be some sort of way to, make sure that demand doesn't offset the system. And to me, this is one of the more obvious ways of making sure that we can go in parallel by able to support vehicle electrification and support, the proper operation of the grid as well.
A series of questions have come in, which we've still got time to take. We've got about 3 minutes to go. Developing countries like Brazil, I mean, what's our opinion? It's not just we've been discussing Norway, China, Canada, US a lot, for instance, and Europe. But what about countries like Brazil and concerning their use of electric vehicles? Are they on a different journey as far as that's concerned? Sophia, you were nodding.
I would say that in Brazil, because I've lived and worked in Brazil some years ago, and I would say probably the area which will electrify first will be buses, so buses and delivery vans and trucks. I think that'll probably be an area where you'll see much faster conversion, again, because people rely a lot on public transport. Personal car ownership is there, but there'll always be affordability gap until you can get price parity and even lower to be able to get electric cars featuring, because of course the infrastructure as well will be a challenge. But definitely I see electric buses and also commercial vehicles being the first out to help reduce the levels of pollution you're seeing there.
Anybody else want to talk about James, would you like to comment on what the pattern that you're going to see across developing countries?
Well, I think the interesting thing about developing countries is that, so many of them have, so many people don't necessarily have cars. They have scooters. They travel in, rickshaw type vehicles, and those things are really, really easy to electrify. The technology's there. The technology's been there for a while. The prices are coming down dramatically. So it makes very obvious sense for people to be able to just plug their vehicle in and run it for a few cents a day, and the purchase price being probably around the same. So that expansion on the smaller vehicle in developing countries, particularly Asia, I think it's going to be big.
Yeah, for sure. For sure, you're going to see two and three wheelers dominating in Asia, especially for an affordability edge.
Well, quite astoundingly, in the Bloomberg report, it said 30% of global two-wheeler sales are already electric.
Wow.
Just make your point, Sophia. I mean, so that's a huge part of the share of the market. I was, quite surprised by the scale of the market growth there. So that's pretty interesting. Just one more question back to you, maybe James, and also Sophia. To level the grid, some companies are recycling car batteries to build energy storage units. Do you believe this could be adopted maybe across the new gas stations? So, I mean, might be a difficult question to answer without some consideration. It's not something I considered.
We are looking at it. So I mean, it's what you call secondary life for batteries and redeployment of batteries is something we're looking at. Because again, as the car park get larger, obviously you're going to have a number of batteries. I mean, batteries are lasting a long time, but we will need to find a home for them when they have served their useful purpose in one form.
Great question. Thank you for that. Well, look, I'm going to finish. We've got 1 minute to go, and we always keep to 45 minutes, although we could do this a lot longer. Let's do it again sometime soon, guys, because it's been fascinating. But let me just ask you for a quick 1 or 2 sentence answers to this one. The future, optimistic, Eric?
Yeah, I'm optimistic. We have the technology to change. We need to change. I think we are going to change.
Sophia?
Absolutely optimistic. It's great to see everyone across the value chain getting on board. I think it can only help, but we can't. Everyone in the value chain needs to play its role. So, very optimistic.
James?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm optimistic as well, because I think, you know, COVID brings a once in a lifetime opportunity to really change some things that we always thought that couldn't be changed. And that's the really important thing about this crisis today is let's change those things that, you know, were once considered impossible.
Well, again, this is a quote that I've used before, but it's a good one. It's not mine, but I'll use it again. I mean, some consultants said, very clever consultants said that if your town gets flattened by a hurricane, you don't just, you rebuild it, but you rebuild it better.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which I think is a great way of perhaps of putting it. And I think having that positive outlook is essential, isn't it, for us right now? So you've all got it. Thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon. And I look forward to chatting with you all again soon. So appreciate you spending the time with us.
Thanks for having us, Dan.
Thanks.
Well, thank you very much to Eric, Sophia, and James for joining us this afternoon, Shop Talk Live. Just looking forward, perhaps, to next week before we sign off. We'll be again. We run these every Friday, 2 o'clock UK time. We'll be back looking at convenience retail and food retail. More so than mobility and electric vehicles next Friday with Scott Annam, David Sands and Dev Dillon, just looking at the work they've done to research what they think retailers should be doing in the new normal. It's the second part of a one-part report which we started off with 5 weeks ago with them as guest panelists. So looking forward to see what they've come up with over the last few weeks and what they feel the next steps are for the global convenience and food retail industry. Thank you very much for tuning in again, and look forward to speaking to you again soon. Good afternoon.